So today we're going to cover middleware, and I'll have quite a few diagrams here that just sort of explain it. We might have seen it before middleware, usually things like loggers. But yeah, so we'll be covering middleware, but we'll also be doing a bit of a review of just the idea of like having these endpoints in the server and what it looks like, both in code but also visually, just like visual diagrams, which I also think is often quite helpful. So yeah, let's take a look. So these are our learning objectives. Um, we want to understand the role of middleware in this request response cycle. And the slides will sort of touch on every one of these. We want to differentiate between different kinds of middleware. So we have some that are just on the application level, so they're with everything. We have some that are route specific, and we have others that are used often to handle errors. Now, I put a little star there because this is something that we can extend on in the afternoon. We want to be able to visualize the creation of a router to manage endpoints related to a resource. So this is something that was mentioned last lecture, well, the morning lecture, and it was talked about as a type of like way to optimize the code that we have. So we'll show that because maybe we want multiple resources on the same server, like not just notes, but maybe we want notes and users because notes belong to users, right? So we also want to be able to examine a visual representation of how requests progress through endpoints. So it's not extremely accurate, to say the least, but it is a good visual model of how it sort of looks. But what's actually happening is it's a lot more involved, but it is a really good analogy. So that's what we'll also be looking at. And one more important thing is looking at how middleware placement impacts what we see. So I remember earlier, this was a good question was asked in the last lecture. Does the order matter in which we have our endpoints? And I remember I said no, not technically no, but now we'll see scenarios where the order actually does matter. It won't impact like the request going through, but it will impact middleware, and we'll see what that looks like. And we also want to be able to understand and implement middleware. Okay, perfect. So here's our client. So we're just going to like introduce middleware. Here's our React app. It's just running on our browser, localhost, probably 3000. And this is our Node Express server. And so we send a request, one of these. And we get a response back. Now, that is roughly where our middleware would go. Somewhere like usually it's actually middleware would sort of be in that area. Technically, it's between the request and the response when it comes back. So an example of some middleware. Yeah, so it fits in the middle of the request response cycle. Before the request actually reaches our endpoint, we can have middleware that does some operations. So console logging, what the request being sent is. So an example of that could be we could log to the console the method, the URL that we're sending it to, the status, the length of the response time and the format, things like that. So let's say we're sending a request to notes. We could have like something like get HTTP localhost 3001 / API / notes 200 OK 314 20 milliseconds. So each of those things has some meaning in the context of that request. And whenever we send that, we could just have that logged in the terminal. So that's like something middleware could do. or before the request reaches or back to the response reaches our clients, like in the case of an error, we could catch that error and process it a bit more. Maybe like we can give some more details about what kind of error it is. So these are some examples, and we'll see all of these in more detail. Okay, so exploring middleware conceptually. So let's discuss the Notes app we introduced previously as an example for exploring middleware. Alrighty, sorry about that. We just took a short pause. Actually, before we get to exploring middleware conceptually, did everyone see the slides get updated on Canvas? I think these slides should be like timed to come out at like 8 a.m. Okay, let me double check that just so you guys have like the slides on hand and can see them as well. Okay, I just double checked and I see it should be okay, perfect. That's good. All right, awesome. So picking up where we left off, we're going to look at an example of kind of like the Notes app that we've been talking about before. We're going to look at that in the context of middleware. And so let's see this here. So that's basically our Notes app. Not the code, but this is more like a visual representation. So as usual, we have our browser here where we can see the React app visually. Although the app itself is running on this localhost 3001. So that's like the server. Well, it's called that, but it's just our client. Usually these terms are quite interchangeable, but I know I put React Dev Server, but this is just, okay, this is like the client that's running our React app. We open it on the browser, and then it's connected to a Node Express server at this address, localhost 3001. We have our local code, app.js, index.js. So that's like our first component app, and then the index.js is like, okay, it puts that inside of the HTML file. And that's actually what we're looking at on the browser. And just again, our Node Express, it's coming from this server.js. And this is sort of like the typical scenario. But when it comes to middleware and the endpoints in more detail, so let's drill down into what is in this orange circle, and then let's really see what these endpoints look like, and what the what the middleware looks like in the context of that. So let's just look at this visual diagram. So I've created a visual of what a request looks like once it passes into the server. So let's see here. So this is a server.js file where all the endpoints exist and where we handle the receive requests. So I just turned it into a visual. So the orange box, this outline, is just the server itself running on localhost 3001. And these boxes here, get ID, and so on, with their label, they signify a box of code that is handling various types of requests. So this is really similar to, what we're seeing in the code, but it's just a visual of that. So we have get by ID, we have post, put by ID, and we have delete by ID. And below, I also just put the the endpoint address. So like the actual full address would be this localhost thing plus this bit here with the API notes and whatever these might be for these respective endpoints. We've written the get endpoint first and the delete last. Now, this does matter with respect to middleware, but again, we'll get into that in more detail. So before we continue, does anyone have any questions about what we're looking at so far? Okay, perfect. So let's imagine we are a put request and we're given, so this is, we are a request that's going through here. And this is sort of a visual also of how you can think of the request as entering and then exiting sort of this server. So let's imagine we are a put request and we have this address to go to. HTTP localhost 3001 /API /notes /6. And we're carrying some data. So what we want to do is update the resource with an ID of 6 with the new data we have. That's the idea of the put request. We can think this is we can think of this as happening visually. So we're sort of, as we proceed, we start here and we go through. We are searching for this. We are this request. And we are not caught by any endpoint until we reach the correct one. So now we're caught. Oh, I think someone might be accidentally unmuted. Okay, perfect. So we are caught there. And then we're caught because the address and the request perfectly matches this one here. And so this is where middleware is important. So I remember I mentioned like order and like why it might matter. So let's imagine we have middleware that logs some data about the request to our console. So now it matters where I put it. If I put it here, green circle, we will see it on the console. If I put it here, we won't. At least for the put ID, because the put request will be caught here before it gets sort of past put. It won't go past that. And so this is just a visual way to show that while order does not really matter when it comes to the endpoints themselves, it sort of does when we have to think about middleware. So, okay, I guess that was more or less right. So the green and red circles represent middleware that logs something about the request to the console. Now, the path that our put request takes, whoops, let me do a larger line size. So the path that our put request takes is sort of like this. We are passing through this green part, right? But we don't get to this red middleware here because we're caught by our endpoint before this one is here. So that's why if we're logging something, this appears on the console, this does not, at least for the put ID request. But if we had a delete, we would pass through both of these before being caught. So the delete would, for both, would log to the console.
So is it because it returns after it gets the put, if after it's captured by the put and it returns, so it kind of bypasses the red one?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's almost like it returns back from here.
Okay.
Or when it returns back from here. So yeah, it is odd, but it's just sort of how it works. And the best way to visualize what is happening or like why this is happening is just thinking of it in this way, that why the order of where you put the middleware matters. If you want if you want middleware to be executed for every single type of request, you will put it here. If you want it to, let's say like maybe you want middleware to handle some endpoint that does not exist, you would actually want to put that there because that would have to be so general and broad for any address. And if you put it here, then any request that goes in the server will just be caught here and nothing would actually happen. So you'd want to put that there, right? And we'll see more examples of that. So this is why the order of where we put our middleware is important. Now we can even, we can even think of the arrow as going through like that. So that is the put request, and then the delete request would go straight through and it's caught here. You can almost think of it like that. So yeah, I hope that
Where is the most commonly, like, we know these are standard get ID, post put ID, and delete ID. So where are the common places where these middlewares are placed? The green and the red spots, these are the standard places?
it really depends on what we want to do. But it could, yeah, if we want some middleware that just gives some information for about any request, yeah, we put it in where the green goes. And this is a quite simple analogy. Like there are more things that can happen. Like for instance, sometimes you can have middleware that like only executes here. Like it only executes on these types of addresses when you send a get by ID. And maybe I can, yeah, we'll try to show an example of that next lecture in the afternoon. Okay, so let's continue and let's look at middleware in code. So we have an example here. I've even linked to the GitHub, but actually I will show y'all here. So if you see here, we're going to talk about, this is a simple example of middleware in code. So let's go to middleware version 1. Let's run the server. So right now the server is running. And so this is sort of what it looks like. This is like the code analogy of that visual diagram. So we have some notes here, and this is just basic setup. Again, it's very similar to what we had before with a get and a post. I don't have the get by ID or delete or anything like that, just these two, but this is my middleware right here. And notice that this is in the code before the app.get. And notice that this one is after the post. And this middleware logs requests. So one more thing, we have this next here. So I'll explain that. So we have request, response, and next. And I console log incoming request, request.method. So is it a put? Is it a delete? What is it? And the URL as well. So both of these get logged. This whole thing is logged. So a request sort of passes through here. Let's say it's a get, so it's caught here. It will pass through this one. So that executes. But one very important part that we need to have is this next. And notice that. That ensures we release the request so it can continue in this sort of, it can basically continue after that. And then it's like, okay, I'm caught here. So let's test that out. Let's see what happens. We're going to do a get. So let's put that there. And so I'm going to send a request. And notice we get a response, yes, but we also get this console log here. Incoming request, get, and then the address. And let's see what happens if we don't have this next. So I remember I mentioned that it can't actually proceed. It doesn't, it's not, the request is caught by the end, by the middleware. It's caught by the middleware as well, but it doesn't get released. So that's why we need that next to actually do the sort of release it. So let's send. And oh, wait, let me did it. Let's close that. There we go. Let's see. So I will get the console log, but I won't actually get a response. And so that's just to show that we need this next here to release it so we can get the response like that. Does anyone have any questions so far about what we're seeing? This is just the code this is a coded example of what we saw visually in the last slide. Okay, perfect. So like which part? Just this bit here? Okay, so uh, right. So let's tap. So basically, what's happening here, this is a simple notes like backend server. It's just already been set up. We have these two endpoints, get and post, but then we also have two middleware. Now, just like on the slide that I showed before, middleware, the order matters. And so in this case, I have the middleware for logging requests happening before my get here. And I have the middleware, well, we'll cover this later, but this is right now what we're going to think about. We have a middleware to log the requests. Then we have a get, the endpoint to handle the get. And then we have an endpoint to handle post. And so what happens is if we send a get request, our request would sort of come through here, and then it would be caught here by this endpoint, right? One thing, though, to note, technically speaking, we pass through, like we do also hit this middleware. So we actually get caught by this middleware, though. This guy gets caught by this middleware here. And here it says console.log incoming request, request.method, request.url. So we are console logging the method of our request, but also like the URL as well. And then this next here, so again, this is sort of a built-in thing, this next. What this next does is it releases, it says here, ensures we release the request. So we release the request, it comes out, it can continue. If we use next, we have to put it as an argument in here. Notice we have request response. Like request response is pretty much default. Next is also, when it comes to middleware, next is the next like argument. And so that is sort of like what is happening with regards to the server when we send a get request. Exactly. So let's test that out. So earlier I just showed that we can send this. Okay, perfect. And we even get this console log here. But if I comment this out, we will get caught there and we won't actually get the response that we want, which is this for the get request. Notice that we get the console log, but we don't get the response. It doesn't pop up here. Right, so great question. So Naveed is asking, what is the main purpose of having middleware? For example, in this case, what what case would we need to log that incoming request, right? So usually it's good practice maybe to log info about requests. And the next example of middleware is actually even more useful. And so we're going to see that right now. So in this case, handling unknown endpoints. So what if our request just goes, like if our request goes straight through and it doesn't match the get, it doesn't match the post. So someone's like sending it to like, I don't know, maybe they sent it to like home, but there is no endpoint to match that. Here we have middleware to handle an unknown endpoint. So any request that isn't caught by the above two will fall into this. And so it will get caught here. And notice that I have no next. I just send back the message unknown endpoint right there. So that's a use case. I'd say this is a good use case for middleware. There are other use cases as well that we can go into later, like if we have errors, like if we send back an error, maybe we want to actually get more information about that error. Like we'll see more examples of that later though, probably next week, because sometimes errors that are returned don't give a lot of information. And we always use .use. Yes, so app.use is for middleware. Yeah. And actually, yeah, so let's test this out with another endpoint or with another request. So let's send a request that we know is going to be unknown. And let's do maybe like delete 2001/API 3. So not only, okay, maybe 2. So that ID exists, but we don't have a delete endpoint. Let's see what happens when I send this. Maybe I forgot to, yeah, I forgot to release that. So it was because I had this here before, so it was just getting caught here in this endpoint, or sorry, in this middleware. So I have to have that next. Okay, let's try that out. And we get that message. So the message we get is unknown endpoint. Does anyone have any questions about this example? So we looked at two cases. We looked at middleware for logging requests, and we looked at middleware for unknown endpoints. And sort of, we're also seeing that actually, I haven't showed you yet why order matters. Okay, let's copy and paste. Let's put this, just comment that out. Let's put this here. Let's see. Now let's see what happens when we send a GET request. So order matters, right? So we will go through this one, but we won't go through this one. Even, well, let's see here, right? We get unknown endpoint, even though we have the right incoming request. So even if we put, let's just see, if I put next here, would it still do that? Yeah, so it even says unknown and actually gives an error. We cannot set headers after there. Right, so after we send this response back to client, we cannot like do anything. We can't like interact with this, like these things after that. But notice, regardless, notice that if my unknown endpoint thing goes here and I do the send of a get, I just get the message unknown endpoint, even though I should be able to handle that request. It's a get and it exists. Now we can see order does matter, right? Because we are getting caught by this one before that. So let's move that back and let's play around with it a bit more. Let's move this middleware for logging requests. Let's move that here And now we can see if I do a GET request, I should not get the I won't get the log, like this console log on my terminal. Oh, I do. Interesting. Wait, did I? Oh, I need to save it. Okay. So I shouldn't get this on my terminal because we are caught here and then we return. We don't get this. Let's just see that. Right, so notice I don't get that console log, but I do get the response back. But if I let's say create a note, because the post request is after this middleware, we should get that. So let's see here. Incoming request, yeah, so now we get it. So this is just sort of has been an example for looking into why order matters. We saw it visually, now we're seeing it in the code. And what sort of we're looking at how moving this middleware will impact what we get, like how things happen in a predictable way. Let me just undo these changes, go back to what I had at the start. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to continue, and we're going to look at this a little bit more. Okay. So let's extend that conceptually a bit. And actually, how I'm going to extend that is I'm going to extend it in a way where I'm also going to teach this idea of router and like having router as a container. So the router as a container for all the endpoints dealing with one kind of resource, like notes. And another router, like let's say a container for dealing with all endpoints of another resource, like user. And so we'll see, we're going to look at that. So, and actually, I think that it would be good visually as a reference just to have this. So I'm just going to take a screenshot of this here. I'm going to share that to the chat just so everybody can have that on hand because I'm going to refer to that screenshot in the next few slides. Okay. So let's extend that further. So we're going to take everything we see in that slide I just sent and like without the middleware. So let's take the middleware out for now. And we're going to put that into its own container. So that like whole orange box. Now that container means to only handle requests sent to the nodes endpoints. So any endpoint with the starting URL, localhost 3001/API/nodes. So that's what it's going to look like. And that basically is, we're going to zoom out of that container that we see in that image that I shared. That's what it's going to look like when we zoom out. And this manages endpoints for a single resource. And it also exists inside the server running on localhost 3001. So it still exists inside server, but now it's sort of like its own container. And I've even put an like route/notes.js. So that has to do with file organization for where the endpoints will go. They're still running and they're referenced. I'll show the code as well. But just visually, this is sort of like what's happening. Okay, so a request we send from any source, be it Postman, the actual React app that's connected to the server, or REST client, with the correct address, will end up going to the router we have to handle interaction with our nodes endpoint. So the idea of compartmentalizing our code in this way is pretty useful. Like into routers is useful, especially when working with more complicated apps. So let's say we also have a users data in our application. So we have notes, and now let's say we have users. Like users can create notes, and notes reference users as well, right? And maybe we want to be able to interact with users, like create user, update information in users and so on. So all the code for the nodes exists in its own file endpoints. And then all the code for the users also exists in its own little file to handle like endpoints with this address. Okay. So kind of like, maybe I'll bring this up here. I can minimize this a little bit. Like each of these containers is pretty much just this. And okay, one thing to just to clarify. Now we'll see this in the code, it'll be more clear, or in the next slide. But the request is not like individually sent to both of these. It's actually passing through it like this. So it's hitting both of these. And again, the order is important, matters here, like in terms of where we put middleware, but also the order of these sort of containers, where we put them in our code, it does matter in the context of like which, like first our request will see this and then it will see that. So that does matter in that case, or it's a useful way of thinking about it. Okay, so let's continue. Right, does anyone have any questions about this idea, like how we go from sort of just having a single one here to like what this means and what this means?
So just to recap my understanding, you're saying that the routes slash nodes.js, so we will have a directory called routes and it will have nodes.js and users.js. And these JS files will have the get ID, post, put ID, and delete ID for nodes, and the same thing for users. Is that right?
Exactly. Perfect. That's correct.
Okay. And when the request comes in, it is kind of, it goes to both the nodes and the users, but in the order in which they are placed. That's what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah. And we'll see that we'll see it in when I will actually show the code as well, and we'll see what it looks like. Yeah.
Okay.
And although one thing I should just clarify is like how this requests are actually interacting is a lot more involved. This is just a useful analogy for visualizing it in terms of like the behavior that we see when we add middleware. So I see a question here. What does middleware do? I'm assuming it's by middle, you mean middleware. So what does middleware do here? So we're going to see that in the next slide, what middleware does in this context and how that changes. Okay, so let's continue. So that was part 3. Okay, this is part 4. So again, great question. How might we add middleware if we have multiple routes? We don't really have the simple case of a single server where we can add middleware in between endpoints inside of a route. Of course, we could do that, but it would be a bit tedious, and there are better ways to add middleware for like the routers. So we're doing the same thing here that we did before. So a hypothetical, so inside server, I've just changed like sort of, instead of being sort of horizontal, now it's vertical. And we're going to do the same thing we did in slide 5. So we're going to have the request going through like that. And in this case, let's make it a hypothetical post request. So now it's sent to, oh, do I not have the address there? Okay. Sorry about that, but it's going to be sent to the localhost 3001 /API/users. So I'll just put that there. And then we have some user data that we're going to. So I just shared that in the chat. So localhost 3001 /API/user. So it's sent to that with some user data because it's a post request. So it's going to be creating a user. And it gets caught in this second endpoint, or sorry, in the second route. And then inside of that, by the post endpoint within the route for users. So much like in the previous example, we would add code to represent middleware. So let's say we have two middleware loggers that console log details about a request. So we're going to add two examples of middleware. Now, where we would add it here is actually, I'm going to put some middleware here. So this green circle is some that it console logs something, okay? And then the red circle also console logs something. So in the context of this particular request to the post endpoint inside of, well, or not even post, just to the users, because we're passing, like, as we're passing through, we will interact with the green one, and then we get released, and then we would interact here, we would go here, basically. We would not, like, get to interact with this red middleware. And so this is just an extension of what we see before, but now instead of having middleware like inside of, like now it's sort of, we've taken it out of being inside of here. Whoops, let me use a different color. It's less, we've taken it out instead of here, it's going to be existing in between these like basically these routes. And we'll see code examples. So basically we're kind of like this. You get caught here, you get released, you get caught here, and then the response comes back. So we don't get to go through that over there. So does anyone have any questions about sort of the shift from like one, I guess, a server.js with just one resource and endpoints to now having multiple resources where we have the endpoints in each of these little compartments that now exist inside server.js. This is, again, I should mention, this is just a visual. We'll see the code like right after. That'll go into a lot more detail.
Okay, I think I need to see the code for that because I still cannot like really absorb the fact that when you say that the middleware, it goes into the green middleware and it gets released. So when you say it gets released, what is being released?
Sorry, the request is being released.
What the request for this one, the one that was going localhost 3001 API users data?
Yes, so any request is being released.
So it is released from doing what? I mean, it is still going to the users.js.
Yes, so it is still, well, it's still going. So let's actually, I guess first I'll show it here. Remember here we had this next.
Right.
So that actually releases the request because the request in this example, this is the simpler example, the request comes through. Let's say it wants to get to this get. It actually is first caught by this middleware because this is not route specific.
Okay,
This
so
is just,
basically it's the middleware that is releasing from itself.
it's from itself, yeah.
Itself, okay.
And then it gets caught here, but this does not release it once it gets caught. It just sends a response back. Exactly. Yep. Okay, so let's see. So we're gonna look at an example, but I actually think first, maybe let's take a 5-minute break, and let's see if we don't have it at all. So I see a question here. If we don't have it at all, what difference will happen? So feel free to I don't quite understand the question, so feel free to clarify.
Yeah, I mean, like if we don't have a middleware at all, and like, you said here it will be caught and then released. So if we don't have it at all, like, we don't have a middleware, but we have still the requests, would we get the response or not?
Yes, we should get the response. So, but the role of middleware is to do things that like we can't do in our endpoint. So maybe we want to log, like we could do it in our endpoints. We could log information about requests, but it's easier to make middleware that does it because we only need to write the code once. Whereas if we write it in our endpoints, we would need to put that in that the logging thing in every endpoint. So it saves on how much code in that case. Maybe we want middleware to handle unknown endpoints. So that's useful. Or to process an error before it comes back. That's also another case. So there are lots of cases that we can use middleware for. Yeah. All right, so we'll take a 5-minute break. So let's come back at, let's say let's make it 9:08. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to write them in the chat. And as soon as we get back, I'll take those questions up. I'm just gonna pause the recording, and then when we come back, I'll resume it. Let's continue from where we left off. Okay, so right, so now let's look at middleware in code. Now let's see this coding example. I'm gonna go into middleware version 2. I'm going to run the server. Still have requests, but okay, so this is what the structure will look like now. It's a lot simpler, but we'll go through it step by step. So this is just the default. This bit allows our server to receive data from some local host. So this is actually not required, I believe, right now, just because we're using REST client to send them. But if we had a React app running on the same localhost, then we would need that. This is required though, so this is so that we can receive JSON data. So that's pretty standard. Right. So now let's just ignore these two for now. Let's look at this. So right now I just have one type of well, let's say route, which is the notes router. So this is the same notes app. I've just converted it to use router. So to do this, I have my routers here, and I have notes.js here, and I'm importing. So notes router require router/notes. Again, notice I don't actually do imports. I do require because it is a different. I think on Node, it's a. Let me just confirm. It is not. I think it just has to do with. It's either use requires, which I think is. Let me just confirm this. Is that common JS? I'll just confirm this. Requires versus imports. It's actually important. Node.js. Yeah, so I think the requires is common JS. So that's something that we use in server to include this sort of packages, and then or from other or importing modules from other files. Whereas on the front end, we would just have import. So I grab the notes router, and then I remember before it was app.post, app.get. If now we just do app.use, but I put the address that is unique for that. So every endpoint inside of the notes router or accessing this notes resource starts with /API/notes, and just like in our previous example. So I would put that here, and then I just put the actual router, and that's about it. And if I go here, so and then we can see our notes. So this is actually where I have starting server data for notes. And here, this is where I initialize. So I say notes router require, so express.router. So that is initializing it. And here I am just adding all the endpoints. So get is just /. Post is also slash. And then module.exports notes router. If I wanted to add like a get request by ID, I would do notes kind of like this, notes router dot get slash ID, kind of like that. And of course, you know, with the request response and so on. Okay, so that is so far one of the changes that we have. Another change that you might have noticed is that I have this utils folder. So that's where I'm going to put a lot of these accessories, functions, and sort of modules. So one of them is the middleware. Let's take a look at that here. So I import my middleware in the same way, requires. And now here I have the middleware. So I have a logger that is going to console log the address. Now, because the address that I get access to is just this part, I add it on top of sort of localhost, although that's not always necessary. I just did that. And then here I have a next, and then the unknown endpoint that I add here, I also have it here. I just have it without the next. Okay, and then I'm making sure to export those two. And then here so this is like just the visual of what we saw, or this is the code of what we saw in the visual earlier, where we essentially, and maybe I can have it side by side. So let me go back a little bit. Take a screenshot of that. Here. I'll send this in the chat as well. So just so we can see sort of side by side. Oops. There we go. So we can see that, although this is a simpler case because we only have one, but you can sort of see that it's like this container is this. And then the middleware, like these circles, are these app.use, middleware.unknown, app.use, middleware.unknown endpoint, and middleware.logger. Okay, so I hope that, and then again, this is like our standard app.listen port running here. Now, there are a lot more optimizations you can make. Like often, even this bit will be in a separate thing that will, like the server, initializing the server will be somewhere else. And like that's actually the file that's run. This is just like even this will be in different places. But right now, this is so far how we're going to optimize it and how we're going to like change it to use, let's say now we have routers. And notice just how simpler and how much cleaner this file, server.js, becomes when we do that. So yeah, does anyone have any questions about sort of what has changed here? Great question. Do we also have a listen in each router? So no, we only have the listen in the server.js because to initialize the server, we're just running server.js in both cases, node server or nodemon server.js. And so that's how all of this is read, and then we listen. Now, what's actually happening is that our Express app, our server, we incorporate cores, we incorporate this .json, which lets us take JSON data. We then, in order, we add in the middleware, and then we add in the notes router, and then we add in this other middleware, and then we listen. So it's like building and creating something that sort of looks like, I guess, in terms of the behavior of the application, it's building and creating something that looks something like this in each of these steps. And listen is actually happening at the end of this process. So let's, yeah, so if nobody has any questions, you can just type in like no questions.
I have one question. It's a basic, simple question. Where do we get the API, this word API? Where is it picked up from? Or is it a standard word that's used?
Right. So that's a great question. So API stands for Application Programming Interface, and what it what it typically refers to is, well, when the interface in it is that, I guess the easiest way to explain it would be, let's think of that open weather API. We can explain it in terms of what it lets us do, or at least that's how I would explain it. In that context, the open weather API, what it lets us do is sort of like we don't have to worry about any internal implementation. All we have to worry about is the request that we send. Do I have the right parameters? Do I have the right URL? Do I have the right data? If I have all of that, when I send that request to Open Weather API, I can trust that I will get the response.
I understand that part. It's just that, can I replace API with, say, Samina? Like, or is it API as an API only?
Oh, sorry. Oh, you mean this?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You can replace that as long as it's consistent with uh like
Like, where is it defined? Because that's what I'm wondering.
so right. So that this is not, sorry, this is not defined anywhere. We just put API because it is like an API. Um it is an sort of all the endpoints exist sort of in this API, in this sort of notes router. But to answer your question, we can make this anything as long as, let's say, like here in the request that we send, we are sending the correct. Let's test it. As long as it's the same, so I can put test here, and then if I put test here and I save these two, that will work.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
But if I send this one, I think it will say unknown endpoint. Oops, why is it doing that? Yeah, unknown endpoint. Because there is no endpoint slash API slash nodes, because when I added this notes router, I'm basically saying every endpoint in the notes router starts with this address slash test slash nodes. So this one does not exist anymore. So as long as it can be anything, but often we put API there.
Sorry, do you call that initially API because like in like the standard, like this kind of data that you save under nodes will be considered an API?
Exactly, that's an excellent point. So yes, so the router and all the endpoints in it are considered an API. And like every one of those is an endpoint, kind of like how in mock API, it's like, yeah, it's kind of similar to that. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So is there anything else that like maybe we can cover here, or is that okay? I guess I can maybe let's send those requests. Actually, one thing I want to see, if I put like some endpoints here, will it get caught? I just want to see that. So let's run. Okay, I just want to see like if I send, given how what I've changed, hopefully this works as intended. What? Running. Oh, interesting. Uh-oh. Okay, so wait. I don't think it was running in the first place. Interesting. So it actually just canceled. Maybe do I have to? Oh, okay, I think I have to run it from the server. I was on notes, so actually that's important. You need to run it on. You have to make sure you're on the server that's running, because then this is the part this is continuously running. That's why. I think when I did it here, it was causing an issue. So anyway, let's test this out. I just want to see if I just want to see if the debugger continues to work as expected when we change the structure to use routes or routers. Let's send that. And perfect. So it's still working as expected. Let's continue. Pineapples. New node. Okay, so it creates that. Perfect. Okay. Just to test, just seeing that's intended, if it's working as expected. Okay, so I think this is good so far. Let's go through a few more examples. And because I made a few more examples of middleware, just because, sometimes I remember when I was first studying this concept, middleware was kind of confusing in the sense of I was not sure why the middleware was behaving the way it was when I sent requests, and I didn't realize until later that the order did matter. So that's why I'm having some of these topics that include middleware and code. So this is an example. Oh, I think we already looked at that. So we'll look at two examples, and then I think in the time we have left, I could show another example that's more complicated, but just not that you need to implement it, but just to see what does it look like when we have more optimizations. Like if we're using, remember we were using .env to save specific information that is maybe secret, and then maybe more, how could we rearrange the structure to make it even more sort of simplified? Exactly. So I can show that after in another example really quickly. But first, we're going to go over some middleware examples. So let's say we have this, and okay, it's our notes, but it could be interchangeable with any sort of resource. Now, let's say the blue middleware is a logger, and what it does is log some data about the request to our console. And the purple middleware here is an unknown endpoint manager. So it's going to behave just like the unknown endpoint did in our previous example. And so what it does is receive any request that reaches that point and automatically returns a response that the endpoint's unknown. So now let's look at some cases here. I'll just ask some questions and feel free to answer in the chat. Or you can also unmute and answer as well. So maybe, yeah. If I send a GET request, just a GET, not GET by ID, but just send a GET request, will I get a console log that gives me details about that request? Perfect. Okay, awesome. What about a post request? Okay, perfect. All right. Now here's a more tricky question. Or I think maybe I gave it away when I said it's tricky. So what about well, what would happen if I send a delete request, delete by ID? No, I'm not saying if I would log. I'm just saying what would happen if I said delete by ID. So you're right, it would console log the request, but would it delete a resource on the server? I'll give another hint. The purple middleware is an unknown endpoint manager. So okay, perfect. Yes. So even, okay, this is a great question. What if the unknown endpoint has next? So even if it has next, it will not let us do it. And I'll show that example here. Let's do that again here. So let me go on the terminal. Let me just like undo the changes there. Okay, so let's go to, we're going to go to the middleware version 1, and I will show that even if it has a next, it's not going to do what we want. So I'm just going to copy and paste this here, and I'm going to put next here. So we're going to send a GET request. So it should go through. We should console log it. But then let's see, is this happening as intended? Let's try that. And if I send this request, I actually get the message unknown endpoint, and I get an error where I'm trying to set headers after they're sent to the client. Because what happens is that after I do a response.send back, I cannot do this next. Because this is like, okay, send the response back to the client, but then it's like, wait, next, continue to next, but I actually can't. So that's actually what this error comes from. So like, even if I got rid of this, I think it still would not. Yeah, I'd still get unknown endpoint, and I wouldn't actually be getting the response that I want. So that's just to show, even with the next in the unknown endpoint, because I have a response.send, I'm sending the response back to the client. Now, I could put the next before that, and then it would work, but it would sort of defeat the purpose of having the unknown endpoint. So there is that example.
So next is basically used by the middlewares only just to release the the middleware that has caught
Exactly.
and
So
basically the way that you've just explained us the rest.send is in whichever place it is, like whether it's in a get or a post, wherever our what's that our request goes there, and if there's a rest.send, that's where it exits, whether there's a next or not. It terminates after rest.send.
exactly, because we're sending our response back to the client. And actually, if after this we try to do things, it will give that error like cannot set headers after we have returned, or like we have returned the client, or we're sent back to the client. So if I try to like do response.set, can we do that? Like rest.set
Or even
header.
a console log, I wonder.
I'm gonna set that. Sure, let's console log hello. Let's see what happens. Oh, let's run that again. Let's do a send. So oh wait. My bad. I'm testing the unknown endpoint. Okay. Oh, so I do get hello, but I get an error. I think the error is from this. If I comment that out, let me try that again. Now I don't get the error. I do get hello, but if I try to, remember, I tried to do the set header. it gives me this cannot set headers after they're sent to the client. So I think next is sort of like, it must be setting headers in order to like release a request. And that's why if I have that next there, it's giving the same error. Although again, that's just a hunch I have based on what I'm getting here. I could be incorrect. So that is something, maybe I'll ask ChatGPT specifics of, I'll ask ChatGPT later, the details of why that's happening in that way, and if those two things are related. Okay, so let's minimize that. So we can use middleware to control requests, and we can also use it to control the response. And actually, I think once we go through one more example, I will show a more complicated version of a program that uses middleware in like a more like dynamic way.
Middleware sounds more like a pit stop, for the requests.
Exactly. Yeah.
So each server should have one middleware and multiple endpoint, because this middleware can control all the endpoint requests.
You don't need to have middleware. It depends. So usually when we saw the logger, maybe we would put that. Actually, that'll be my next question. So it depends on what we want. So let's say, actually, I'll ask a question. If we want the logger to give us, like, when we remember how we saw the logger was console logging to the terminal, some information about the request, like the endpoint it's being sent to, and like just anything, the stuff inside that request. Where might I, like, let's say the blue one is the logger. Where might I move the blue middleware in this sort of image? Where would I move it so that every endpoint is going to, like, it's going to be active for every endpoint. It's not going to, let's say, miss an endpoint.
You're gonna zoom out and put it like in the beginning of all endpoints.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So in this case, I would move this from here to here. So, because then every request would start, like if it's coming through here, it'll sort of pass through this and then be released, and then it'll continue. Because right now, if I send a GET request here, I will not, like, given the way that it is right now without this here, if I send a GET request, it will not do that.
But what's gonna happen if we did not use the middleware? We did not have the message that we don't have like unknown endpoint. If we don't have it, what's gonna happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's see what happens, actually. I think it might give us an error. It might still give us an error, but it won't be controlled. But let's see. Let's actually console log this out, this unknown endpoint. And let's test, oops. Let's test an unknown endpoint. Yeah, so it does give us, it actually still returns an error, but it's not, it just says cannot post API notes unknown, or cannot, I think it just says that. That's, you know what, this is interesting, because if we made middleware that was an error handler, we could like get, we could grab this and put that in the response message. I'd have to look into how to do that, but like if it's caught here, maybe let me see what happens. Let's use this. I just want to see like console.log. I just want to see like what is the response at this point in time, if it's maybe built in or not. Oh, so that's a lot of information. Let's see. Maybe I can narrow down. Okay, well, it's undefined, but sorry, I guess maybe that's something I can look into later. So you're right, even without having this like here, it will still send a response like 404 unknown. But maybe we want to control that. We don't want to return, just like we want to return our own message if that happens. So we can do that. And I think even we could put, maybe we could do this. Maybe that's better, having this thing here. And then if I do create, if I send a request to the unknown endpoint, yeah, now notice that it's actually saying like the endpoint. So that's good. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna minimize that. Okay, so let's go to our next example. So example number 2. This is a bit more complicated because this is going to be the case where we have a router. So again, let's say that our purple middleware is a logger. And all it does is log some data about the request to our console. The green is an unknown endpoint manager. What it does is receive any request that reaches that point and automatically return the response that the endpoint is unknown. Okay, so given the setup, if I send a GET request to my notes, will it be logged? Like, will I see any information about that? Okay, what about a post request to notes? And a delete request? Okay, good. So you guys get the idea that, so that question, I was just kind of reviewing this idea that all those endpoints, get, post, put, and so on, for nodes exist inside of that little container there. Localhost 3001 /API /nodes, or like the router /nodes. So that's good. Okay, what will happen if I send a request to the users and maybe I send like a post request to users? All right, so I see will logger. Well, in this case, so I think I might have switched the colors around, but in this case, the green is an unknown endpoint manager. So it receives any request and it just returns that the endpoint's unknown. Yeah. So let's just say, what will happen if I send a post request to users endpoint? Or nothing. Yeah, perfect. So nothing will happen. Neither do I log anything, nor do I even get there because I get an unknown endpoint. Okay, perfect. So now, next question, what should I change about this to make this work as intended? Where should I move my purple middleware and where should I move the green middleware? And actually, feel free to annotate. I think there is an annotation tool, so feel free to annotate. I think, do you guys have access to annotating? Yeah. And maybe just, let's try to use the same colors just so we can see. Yeah. Okay. Okay, perfect. So that looks correct to me. So purple first before our notes, like our route notes, like purple is first and then green at the end. So that's good because then now it's logging every request and the unknown endpoint goes after all of the the routes that we've added in. So that's good. Perfect. All right, so does anyone have any questions about sort of like what's anything we have covered in this lecture?
I just have one question, Alim, about oh, what's happened? About how we gonna like ordering the files. Like the directory gonna be for the server, then inside the directory server gonna have a directory for routers and a directory for middleware.
Exactly. So this would be the version 2. And actually, I think I'll add that into the assignment because in the assignment so far, it's still like just a simple version without the routes. But I think I'll add that in because now you guys have seen it, so I'll add that bit in that once you're done making it work without in the first case, incorporate the router with this sort of thing.
And
Okay.
all of these gonna be in the public or in the source when we using the React. Like all these server files or
Okay,
directory
so
folder.
this stuff will be separate. So let's look at an example of a React. Notice that this Notes app version 2, there's a client. The client has all the React code, like the front end code, app, main, etc. Server there's a server directory that has my server. And if I'm I need to have both of them. I need to have the server running in one terminal and the front end running in a different terminal. Kind of like in that photo that we saw earlier, where localhost 3000 is that's where I'm running my React app, and 3001 is where I was running my Express server.
So here in the server, you're gonna have the request folder. Inside the request, you're gonna have the endpoint and the where, the middleware.
No, sorry, the request server does not have the endpoints. That's just a place where I put these REST.
Oh, the Express, yeah, okay.
And then the server here, this is where I actually put the Express like stuff and the endpoints.
Okay, so this version doesn't have still middleware or route.
Exactly.
Okay,
it might have middleware. I don't think it has the router. This version has the router, but essentially all that would happen is that like this thing could just be interchanged with the server here and it would work.
Okay.
As long as the addresses are correct in terms of where the client, because all that's happening is in my services here, like all that changes, I can just choose the address to send it to. And as long as I have my server running, everything will work. Like, oh yeah, one thing.
Okay.
Maybe just to look over this. So I have my server here. So this is the version with the version 2 of middleware. So this is the version where I put routers. And so now we have a notes router and we have it at this address. We have the notes router. Because in the actual notes, we just have like / because it's understood that the address will end with.
Okay, but for the middleware, I don't have to put it in separate file. I can just put it in the server itself.
Exactly. Well, I think what we're going to do for the assignment is that initially that's fine. Like in this case, the middleware is just in the server here. It's happening before, but that's only when we have one resource. So multiple resources, or if we explicitly ask, like in this case, I move the middleware to its own middleware.js, and I'm exporting it here.
Okay.
Here I added in this way.
Okay, okay.
Alim, there's one more question. So yesterday when I pulled the module 5 from CIC the GitHub, and I made some changes in the file, the assignment that the homework that you had given. So if I pull it again, will that be overwritten, or do I need to rename that?
I don't know if you need to pull it because I don't think any changes really have been made. Like
This
all the
work,
code that we're looking at, I already have it there.
oh, it's
Like,
already.
yeah, it's already there.
But for future, like,
But for yeah, um,
so I need to make my own changes in a separate folders, perhaps.
maybe just in case, you could make them in you could check out a different branch and then switch back to, and then fork. And because the fork will fork from main, I believe, into main. And then once those changes come in, you can then go into the separate branch and pull from main. And then there'll be some merge conflicts. There might be merge conflicts, probably not, just because I don't think any of the lectures will modify the existing code that we already have from like the last lecture.
Right.
So that's one way to do it.
But if I rename that file, and I do a pull, the original file name would not be existing. So it will just copy that file, right? But will it override or delete the renamed file? Like if I rename it to Samina, for example. So will it
I'm not too familiar with how GitHub like actually interprets that. Like, I'm not sure because I would say though it might just to be safe, it's probably better just to check out a different branch, like with your own name, just a branch from main that has that, and then do the pull in that way. Yes, I don't think. Yeah, I'm not sure because like I remember in the GitHub lecture when we were doing some like merge conflicts and things like that. I remember there were some new things I was learning about GitHub, so I'm not like 100% sure of what would happen. All right, so we do have some time left, so maybe it's up to you guys. We can either take a 10-minute break, or I could show an example of a more complicated version of a project where there's more middleware being used. Like you don't need to, certainly, I don't think we'll anytime soon we'll get to doing something like that, but just to see, it's up to you guys though. So I'll leave it as a vote. Okay. Let's open a new one. Okay, so here's a more complicated version. Actually, do these changes. So this is a server, and okay, let's not worry about this. So the one thing that I do want to show is here we have blogs, we have users, and we have login. So this is a more complicated case of where it's an application. It's not, there's no front end yet, but the backend supports logging in. So users exist. Users have to log in to be able to create something called a blog or update blogs or delete blogs. But the more important thing to note is that notice here that I have some middleware. It's like user extractor. And not only is it a bit odd, the middleware, but also the middleware is only being added to the blogs router. So this is a case, I remember I mentioned that we can use the middleware to like do processing for us. And so in this case, the middleware extracts a user from the request being sent. Now that is kind of odd. And then we have another middleware that extracted. So some of this, again, don't really worry too much about what these do per se. It's more just that now it's like there's an actual very important use case for the middleware to do things that make our application work. And maybe I can show, I think it's more important just to show the middleware. So here, oh, one more thing, we have this error handler. So here's another case. An error being sent, the request, response next. So if the error name is this, we send this response. So basically, this is handling for errors. And actually, remember when we were checking, so this is more relevant where, well, we're going to see why we might need something like this. It's more relevant when we are connected to a database and our endpoints now interact with that database. Maybe there's like an error in the database, and then that returns an error to our endpoint. And then we need to be like, oh, okay, then we might need middleware to handle that error. It's not always necessary. I even said here probably unnecessary, but I copied this over from the previous part that I was working on. This bit here, this is another example. Like this is actually a more important example of middleware usage, where now we're doing, so what this is a token. So in order to, and you guys will be seeing this later, probably for the final project, but in order to have login working, we need to do something where we create a token. So when someone logs in, a token is created, and then every request to interact with some resource that is like restricted by login, they have to send the token in a authorization header. And so that's what this is doing. The request has an authorization header. So I grab what's inside of that. And then I grab the token and I set the token. Like here, we are updating the request to have a token and that it has something there. And notice that here, I have that token extractor happening before any sort of like any of these endpoints. So this middleware is happening first before our request hits the endpoint. So it's like because of the position of that, we can trust that if a user logs in and tries to create any resource, the token will exist inside of the request. And why that's important is that in the endpoint itself, let's say for creating a blog in this blogs router, maybe we need to grab request.token to check something like, does this person actually have permission, something like that. And so that's just a scenario where that is relevant.
Alim, the file that you just showed, they were all of them were get.use. So they were all middlewares?
No. So even when we add and like routers, we use app.use.
Oh, okay.
But these are middleware. This is middleware, but this is middleware that only exists when we interact with the blocks router. So we won't worry too much. Like, again, this is like kind of like in like a month's time or something like that. Like it's just to show, but a lot of people are asking like, why use middleware and so on. So I'm just showing a scenario where middleware usage it's almost like, if not necessary, it makes things a lot easier. It's not necessary. You don't need to like, this is implemented without the middleware. You add the middleware in later, but it makes things a lot easier if you use middleware to do this like extra processing. So yes. Okay. So I'm going to, I think that's about everything for today.